Hallelujah.
Damn. David, did you know that the S in Sam Harris stands for savage? We're going right into a Sam Harris Best Comebacks compilation. First, please click like and subscribe below, and I'm gonna hit play right now. Thank you.
That point of not knowing what happens after death is what worries me about this conversation. I've been very worried about this, that all of you have given up a perfectly serviceable Tuesday evening only to hear the four of us tell you every which way that we have no idea what happens after death. Well, I expressed the spirit of my wife, and she was actually able to put me at ease. I'm worried, obviously, about boring all of you, and she said, "Nothing Hitchens does is ever boring."
Okay.
So I have that going for me. Right. I think we should think about what this concept of the afterlife does. We'll talk about the plausible versions of it and how implausible some of the traditional ones are. But I think, just to give some context, we're living in a world in which 9 million children every year die before they reach the age of 5. Okay, year after year after year. I mean, that is an Asian-style tsunami of the sort you remember from 2004 every 10 days, killing only children before the age of 5. I mean, think about these children. Think about their parents. Know that virtually all of these parents are people who believe in God and were praying all the while that their children would be saved. And their prayers were not answered. Now, the afterlife comes into the midst of this reality and as a promise that all of this is going to make sense in the end, that somehow at the end of existence we are going to be all let in on the punchline and have a mighty laugh with Almighty God for eternity. Now, there's no evidence of that, and I think, therefore, this concept of the afterlife really functions as a substitute for wisdom. It functions as a substitute for really absorbing our predicament, which is that everyone is going to die. There are circumstances that are just catastrophically unfair. Evil sometimes wins, and injustice sometimes wins. And the only justice we're going to find in the world is the justice we make. And I think we have an ethical responsibility to absorb this really down to the soles of our feet. And this notion of an afterlife, that the happy talk about how it's all going to work out and it's all part of God's plan, is a way of shirking that responsibility.
Interesting. But the problem is that without God and without a promise of an eternal existence after death, life appears to be an emergency. It's a long emergency for many of us, but it is an emergency. You can't help but notice that things are going very wrong in this place. I mean, no matter how much fun you are having, a glance at a newspaper will show you that it's possible to have no fun at all. Okay, and everyone seems to have a run of bad luck in the end.
One thought is, okay, are you really going to measure your sense of the world from newspapers? With the internet landscape, they've shifted to have to be really, really effective at getting clicks. What that means is that they'll try to tap into really intense emotions to get you to click onto it. What is that? That's fear and anger. I think those are the two biggest emotions, at least fear for sure. It's just rage bait, right, is what the titles look like. So, if you're basing your worldview off of media titles, maybe you'd want to, of course, you're going to feel a sense of emergency in your life, right? Now, maybe he's just making an overblown example just as to make a point, but let's keep going.
Now, it's hard not to see the absurdity of this situation. You unwrap your shiny new iPad, upon which you hope to squander an unconscionable amount of time and attention, only to discover that perhaps on the iPad itself, that the people who built this gorgeous device live lives of such unendurable drudgery that they regularly hurl themselves off the rooftops at the factory where they work. Nets have been installed to catch their falling bodies. Is there any sense to be made of disparities in luck of this kind? Religion makes sense of it. It's my karma. It's God's will that I'm so lucky. If God had wanted me to do dangerous and deadly boring work for a few dollars a day, that's what I would be doing. But as it happens, he wants me to have a new iPad. Hallelujah.
Interesting. So what I love about what he does is he addresses what typical people think. I think that makes it very relatable what he's talking about. Jordan Peterson does criticize him, rightly so, for saying he doesn't contend with, the greats of history, Nietzsche, Jung, who have tackled the question of religion. And there's something missing there for sure that he hasn't addressed. But he does address what most people think, and that's something.
You can make a philosophically respectable argument that consciousness could survive the death of the brain. It's by no means the majority opinion in neuroscience or philosophy that it would. For instance, there's a philosopher at Oxford, Nick Bostrom. This is one of the weirder arguments, but still more plausible than the arguments you get from religion. Nick, there's actually very little you have to assume to make this seem somewhat robust. The argument is called the simulation argument, and he argues that we are all very likely not living in a real universe, but living in a simulated universe. And we are being simulated on the hard drives of computers of the future. Now he gets there with a few simple steps. You simply have to acknowledge that consciousness is at bottom the result of information processing at the level of the brain. And there's nothing magical about brains. It could be information processing in a computer of the future. Most scientists think that's true. They don't think there's anything magical about the wet stuff in our heads, and that consciousness is at some point going to be instantiated in computers. Then you simply have to grant that humans of the future will run simulations of the past in the way that we run simulations, Sims games, and then there's just one short move that simulated universes, almost by definition, will outnumber real universes, and therefore we are a lot more likely to be among the simulated ancestors than the real ancestors. Now, again, this everyone acknowledges it seems a little crazy, but the assumptions you take on board are not so weak.
That's funny.
And I would add to this the somewhat disconcerting idea that if in fact we are running as a simulation on a computer of the future, this computer could have been built by Mormons or Scientologists who would want to simulate the truth of their religion. And therefore all religions could be true in this simulated universe, and we could expect to see Jesus coming back on clouds of glory and moving to Missouri as the Mormons expect. So now all of that sounds completely crazy, but it is not as crazy as the version of the afterlife that is really on offer traditionally, which has been actually neatly sidestepped here because it entails the resurrection of the dead. Most people think that the afterlife religion is offering, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, has something to do with the soul floating off the brain into a tunnel of light and into paradise. But that's actually not the canonical afterlife. The canonical afterlife is God has to do the humble work of reassembling us. And I don't want to take more than my allotted time here, but I think we should talk about just how implausible that vision is, because that actually is the vision of Judaism and Christianity and Islam.
In the United States, we still have to argue about contraception, about whether women should have access to birth control. Forget about abortion. Contraception is still something we're fighting for. The Catholic Church, one of the richest institutions on earth, will oppose contraception with its last breath. And in so doing, it imagines it's exercising the most finely calibrated morality the earth has ever seen, all the while nurturing an army of child rapists. and protecting them from secular justice and shuttling them from parish to parish so they can find fresh victims, and threatening these victims with endless litigation in this life and hellfire in the next. The misuse of human energy, the needless manufacturing of unhappiness just boggles the mind.
You can't argue against the corruption that happens in any kind of structure that human beings make. That kind of thing, like, you can't say that there isn't corruption in the church. You know, you could talk about rates. I don't know if there's less or more rates. I don't know what that would look like. But hey, that's a really good point he's making, so you better listen.
So moral and political progress is difficult, even in rich nations where there should be nothing but progress.
I just want to kind of show you all how the sausage of faith gets made. Or at least argued for. I see two problems with what you just did, and perhaps you're aware of them. One is that Maimonides actually said that this could not be understood allegorically or in any other way, but literally he came back 25 years later after he had been misunderstood in the Guide to the Perplexed, and wrote, I think in his commentary to the Mishnah, that the resurrection is a literal truth, has to be believed in. There may be some caveats there in his theology, but he was talking about bodies being reanimated. The other issue is you made this sort of artful move to the free will loophole. You said people have free will. If a man wants to lock his daughter in a dungeon and have sex with her, God has allowed that because he's given us this rather diabolical freedom. That doesn't cover all of the other suffering for which only God can be responsible if he exists. The 9 million children
I agree with
I just talked about dying every year. Through cancers and violence and accidents and lack of access to clean water, and this is God's fault if God exists. I mean, either he can do nothing about this, or he doesn't care to. So either he's impotent or evil. I mean, this is the problem that the free will doesn't get you out of.
But the problem is that most people, most of the time, are desperate to believe ridiculous and divisive ideas for patently emotional reasons. And while rarely explicit, what they're really worried about is death. And when we're arguing about teaching evolution in the schools, I would argue that we are really arguing about death. It seems to me the only reason why any religious person cares about evolution is because if their holy books are wrong about our origins, they are very likely wrong about our destiny after death. So when you say to someone that you're a fool for not believing in evolution, or a fool to think the universe is 6,000 years old, I think that gets translated as you're a fool to think that your daughter who died in a car accident is really in heaven with God. And that is a very different communication. Before I can get to the end of this sentence, something unforeseen and terrible will happen to somebody somewhere. And we will read about it in the newspaper tomorrow. The question is, how can people close to these tragedies make sense of them? And religion provides an answer for that. It's an unjustified answer. It's a bad answer. It's an answer that comes with a host of other liabilities, because one being that it has birthed a many competing and irreconcilable answers, and therefore religious conflict and political tribalism seem impossible to overcome. But religion does provide an answer that most people think they need. And the schism among secularists, the fact that so many people at this conference are regularly attacked for criticizing religion, follows from this point. And people are worried about the grief of other people. The scientists and journalists who have made a career out of attacking the so-called new atheists are worried about the grief of other people?
There's some confusion here. I think there's a real asymmetry between science and religion that shouldn't go unobserved. And there's an effort on the part of David and Bradley to not own the very clear propositional claims that have been made by every religion for millennia. Claims about the way the universe is structured. Very explicit claims about what's going to happen in the future, about what happened in the past, about what happens after death. And these claims are incompatible. So, for instance, if Buddhism is true, Buddhism purports to be true. Buddhism has a doctrine of karma and rebirth. You can be reborn as an animal. You can be reborn in various realms. If Buddhism is true, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are absolutely false in their core claims. I mean, these are not pictures that can be squared logically. And every religion is in the business of making these claims about the afterlife and about all manner of other things. And the crucial difference between religion and science is that every religion is beholden to its literature and doesn't think, for the most part, apart from the fringe of kind of liberal intelligentsia, for the most part, people don't think it's man-made. They don't think that these are just books. If everyone read the Bible like Shakespeare, Hitch and I would be doing something entirely unrecognizable right now. I mean, there would be no problem. And so the problem we're articulating is everyone has this idea that they have knowledge about the afterlife, the end of days, the virgin birth of certain people, etc. And these are claims to truth, and they are profoundly anti-scientific because you can't edit the books. You can't edit the Quran. You can't edit the Bible. You can't acknowledge freely within the context of the faith that there are just mountains of life-destroying nonsense in these books, and that's a problem.
Interesting.
Don't you know that there's going to come a day when you'll be sick or someone close to you will die, and you'll look back on the kinds of things that captured your attention, and you'll think, what was I doing? You know this, and yet if you're like most people, you will spend most of your time in life tacitly presuming you'll live forever. I mean, it's like watching a bad movie for the fourth time. Yeah. or bickering with your spouse. I mean, these things only make sense in light of eternity. I mean, there better be a heaven if we're going to waste our time like that. So unlike religious people, we atheists really have a good reason to make the most of life, to make the most of the present moment. Because even if you live to be 100, there are just not that many days in life.
There's a false assumption about science
True.
operating here. Science is not in principle committed to the idea that there's no afterlife, or that the mind is identical to the brain,
Right.
or that materialism is true. Science is completely open to whatever in fact is true. And if it's true that the consciousness is being run like software on the brain and can, by virtue of ectoplasm or something else we don't understand, can be dissociated from the brain at death, that would be part of our growing scientific understanding of the world if we could discover it. Now, and there are ways we could in fact discover that if it were true. The problem is there are very good reasons to think it's not true. And we know this from now 150 years of neurology, where you damage areas of the brain and faculties are lost. And they're clearly, it's not that everyone with brain damage has their soul perfectly intact, they just can't get the words out. This is everything about your mind can be damaged by damaging the brain. You can cease to recognize faces, you can cease to know the names of animals, but you still know the names of tools. I mean, the fragmentation in the way in which our mind is parcellated at the level of the brain is not at all intuitive, and there's a lot known about it. And what we're being asked to consider is that you damage one part of the brain, and the mind, something about the mind and subjectivity is lost. You damage another, and yet more is lost. And yet if you damage the whole thing at death, we can rise off the brain with all our faculties intact, recognizing grandma and speaking English. Now,
that's really interesting. Damn.
David?
And I think a much more important point is if everything you're saying about your religious orientation is true, because you're basically confessing a kind of scientific attitude toward the mysteries of subjectivity and what happens after death, then the usefulness of holding to these traditions and these first century books is I'm completely at a loss. I mean, it seems like you're in the wrong line of work. You should be psychology.
So that was Sam Harris. Thank you for watching this. If you enjoyed it, please click like and subscribe below. We're going to keep doing more of these things. I'd like to know if you enjoyed this one. I listen to your feedback. So have a good day. Please enjoy.